Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, edited by Harry Elmer Barnes. Subsection 4. Smearing revisionist books. When, rather rarely and for one reason or another, a newspaper or a periodical decides actually to review a revisionist book rather than to accord it the silent treatment, it has available a large supply of hatchet men who can be relied upon to attack and smear revisionist volumes and to eulogize the work of court historians and others who seek to perpetuate the traditional mythology. For example, the New York Times has on its own staff of such hatchet men, among them Otto D. Talisius, Charles Poor, Orville Prescott, Carl Schriftgieser, Drew Middleton, and others. When these do not suffice, it can call upon academicians of similar inclination, such as Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Allan Nevins, Henry Steele Commager, Gordon A. Craig, Samuel Flagg Bemis, Dexter Perkins, and others. The Herald Tribune has Walter Millis, August Heckscher, and their associates on its staff, and also turns to such academicians as those mentioned above, whose gifts and talents are not limited to the Times. The smearing device used almost universally in discrediting neo-revisionist books is a carryover of the propaganda strategy perfected by Charles Michelson in Political Technique and extended by Joseph Goebbels, John Roy Carlson, and others, namely, seeking to destroy the reputation of an opponent by associating him, however unfairly, with some odious quality, attitude, policy, or personality, even though this may have nothing to do with the vital facts in the situation. It is only a complex and skillful application of the old adage about giving a dog a bad name. This is an easy and facile procedure, for it all too often effectively disposes of an opponent without involving the onerous responsibility of facing the facts. The quote-unquote Blackout boys have even implied that the effort to tell the truth about responsibility for the Second World War is downright wicked. Samuel Flagg Bemis declares that such an excursion into intellectual integrity is, quote, serious, unfortunate, deplorable, end quote. Inasmuch as the Morgenstern book was the first to shake the foundations of the interventionist wartime propaganda, and because Morgenstern is not a professional historian of long time standing, his work was greeted with an avalanche of smears. Virtually, the only fair reviews of the Morgenstern volume were those by Edwin M. Borchard, George A. Lundberg, Harry Paxton Howard, and Admiral H. E. Yarnell. There was rarely any effort whatever to wrestle with the vast array of facts and documentary evidence which, both Beard and Admiral Yarnell maintained, bore out all of Morgenstern's essential statements and conclusions. Rather, he was greeted with an almost unrelieved volley of smears. Some reviewers rested content with pointing out that Morgenstern is a young man and hence cannot be supposed to know much, even though the New York Times handed over to Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., a younger man, the responsibility for reviewing Beard's great book on President Roosevelt and the coming of the war in 1941. Another reviewer asserted that all that needed to be said to refute and silence the book was to point out that Morgenstern is employed by the Chicago Tribune. Others stressed the fact that he's only an amateur, dabbling with documents, without the training afforded by the graduate historical seminar, though Morgenstern was an honor student of history at the University of Chicago. It was apparent to unbiased readers that most of the professors who reviewed his book departed entirely from any seminar canons of research and criticism, which they may have earlier mastered. Morgenstern surely worked and wrote in closer conformity to von Ranke's exhortations than his professional reviewers. Other reviewers sought to dispose of the Morgenstern book by stating that it was quote-unquote bitterly partisan, was composed in a state of quote-unquote blind anger, or written with unusual asperity, though it is actually the fact that Morgenstern is far less bitter, angry, or blind than his reviewers. Indeed, the tone of his book is more one of urbane satire than of indignation. Few books of this type have been freer of any taint of wrath and fury. The attitude of such reviewers is a good example of what the psychologists call the mechanism of projection. The reviewers attributed to Morgenstern the blind anger that they themselves felt when compelled to face the truth. In reviewing the book for the Infantry Journal of May 1947, Harvey A. de Veerd declared that it was, quote, the most flagrant example of slanted history, end quote, that had come to his attention in recent years. But he failed to make it clear that the uniqueness in the slanting of Morgenstern's book was that it was slanted toward the truth, something which was and still is quite unusual in historical writing on this theme. Probably the most complete smearing of the Morgenstern book was performed by Walter Millis in the Herald Tribune Book Review of February the 9th, 1947. Though, with all the extensive space at his disposal, he made no serious effort to come to grips with the facts of the situation. He merely elaborated the smear in the caption, quote, twisting the Pearl Harbor story, a documented brief for a highly biased, bitter, cynical view, end quote. Gordon A. Craig of Princeton, reviewing the book in the New York Times, February the 9th, 1947, rested content with stating that the book was no more than anti-Roosevelt mythology and completely unbelievable, though he adduced no relevant evidence in support of these assertions. One of the most remarkable attacks on the book was made by a one-time ardent revisionist historian, Orrin J. Hale, in the Annals of the American Academy, July 1947. After first assailing the book with the charge of bitter partisanship and asserting that the author made only a fake parade of the externals of scholarship, Hale sought manfully but futilely to find serious errors in Morgenstern's materials. He then concluded that all or most of the statements in the book were true, but that the book as a whole was a great untruth. This reverses the usual line of the current apologist for the Roosevelt foreign policy, like Thomas A. Bailey and Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who now agree that most of Roosevelt's policy statements thereupon were untrue, but that his program as a whole was a great truth, which exemplified the desirable procedure of the good officer, the conscientious public servant. The fact that Morgenstern is an editorial writer for the Chicago Tribune, and that the Tribune has opened its columns to revisionist writings, has encouraged the Smeerbund to seek to identify revisionism and all revisionist writers with the Tribune. Even Beard's books were charged with being dominated by the Tribune policy. Only recently, a reviewer in the New Yorker linked Beard and the Tribune and referred to the Charles Austin Beard Chicago Tribune view of war origins. Max Lerner wrote that, quote, the man who once mercilessly flayed Hearst became the darling of McCormick, end quote. No phrase of the smear campaign could well be more preposterous. Aside from being willing to accept the truth relative to the Roosevelt foreign policy, Beard and the Tribune had little in common. The American Civil Liberties Union once warmly praised Colonel McCormick for his valiant battle against the Minnesota press gag law. There was no attempt then to link the Civil Liberties Union with the total editorial policy of the Tribune. Roger Baldwin was not portrayed as a tool of Colonel McCormick, nor was there any hint of a Civil Liberties Union McCormick axis. Those who write in behalf of freedom of the press can always gain access to the columns of the Chicago Tribune, but there is no thought in such cases of linking them with the total editorial policy of the Tribune. Due to the fact that Beard was a trained and venerable scholar, and hence obviously not a juvenile amateur in using historical documents, that he had a worldwide reputation as one of the most eminent and productive historians and political scientists that the United States has ever produced, that he had served as president of the American Political Science Association and of the American Historical Association, that he was awarded in 1948 the gold medal of the National Institute of Arts and Letters for the best historical work of the preceding decade, it required more than usual gall and trepidation to apply the smear techniques to Beard and his two splendid books on American foreign policy. Yet Beard did not escape unscathed, though his facts and objectivity cannot be validly challenged. As Lewis Martin Sears pointed out in the American Historical Review, quote, "The volume under review is said to give annoyance to the followers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If that be true, their faith is scarcely founded upon a rock, for no more objective treatment could readily be conceived. The author nowhere injects a personal opinion." End quote. Any testimonials as to Beard's historical prowess are invariably a red flag to the smearbund bull. Only this consideration makes such things as Lewis Mumford's resignation from the National Institute of Arts and Letters because of the award of the above-mentioned medal to Beard, or Harry D. Gideons's explosion in the new leader, at all explicable. The difficulty of attacking Beard relative to his status as an historian diverted most of the smearing of him into the allegation that his work is invalidated and unreliable because he was an quote-unquote isolationist. The absurdity of this charge is obvious. Beard did, from 1937 onward, courageously and sanely warn against the manner in which the Roosevelt policies were deliberately leading us into a foreign war against the will of the overwhelming mass of the American people in what was supposed to be a democratic system of government. Beard's stand may not have been wise, though the facts today overwhelmingly prove its soundness. But such an attitude has nothing whatever to do with any literal isolationism unless one defines internationalism as chronic meddling abroad and unwavering support of our entry into any extant foreign war. Any attempt to brand Beard as a literal isolationist is, of course, completely preposterous. Few men have had a wider international perspective or experience. In his early academic days, he helped to found Ruskin College, Oxford. He had traveled, advised, and been held in high esteem from Tokyo to Belgrade. The irresponsibility of this form of smearing Beard is well illustrated by the innuendo of Samuel Eliot Morison and Perry Miller that Beard was an ignorant isolationist with an archaic and naive view of world affairs because he was deaf and lived on a farm with his cows, thus implying that he had shut himself off from the world and human associations and did not know what was going on about him. That such charges were utterly without foundation is well known to anybody with any knowledge whatever of Beard and his mode of life, and must have been known to be untrue by Admiral Morrison and Professor Miller themselves. Beard provided himself with a most efficient hearing instrument, which enabled him to carry on personal conversations with the utmost facility. He probably enjoyed wider personal contact with scholars and publicists than any other American historian down to the day of his death. He was visited at his suburban home constantly by a stream of prominent academic and scholarly admirers. He traveled widely and spent his winters in North Carolina. His deafness did not affect his personal relations or scholarly interests and activities in the slightest. His mode of life, at the most, only gave him the occasional quiet and detachment needed to digest and interpret the mass of information which came to him as a result of his wide reading and his extensive personal contacts with Americans and foreign scholars, both young and old. His dairy farm was located some 20 miles from his home. I was present a few years ago at a conference on foreign affairs attended by about 40 leading savants. Most of them wrung their hands about the sorry state of the world today, but only 2 or 3 were frank and candid enough to discern and admit that the majority of the conditions which they were so dolorously deploring stemmed directly from the foreign policies of Franklin D. Roosevelt, from his Chicago Bridge speech of October 1937 to the Yalta Conference of early 1945. Beard was assailed for his isolationism and cultural lag, both by the chairman and the chief participant, for no earthly reason, save that he opposed the policies which had led to the chaos over which the conference was holding the coroner's inquest, but with no intention of declaring it a homicide or seeking the culprit. They vented their spleen on a man who had advised against risking the ambuscade which led to the murder. It is both vicious and silly to brand a person an isolationist merely because he opposed our entry into the Second World War. Personally, I opposed our entry with all the energy and power at my command, just as vigorously as did Beard. But it also happens that I wrote one of the longest chapters in the first important book ever published in behalf of the League of Nations, and that I have ever since supported any move or policy which seemed to me likely to promote international goodwill and world peace. Sane internationalism is one thing. It is something quite different to support our entry into a war likely to ruin civilization, mainly to promote the political prospects of a domestic leader, however colorful and popular, to satisfy the neurotic compulsions of special interests and pressure groups, and to pull the chestnuts of foreign nations out of the fire. The whole issue of isolationism and the epithet isolationist has been a very effective phase of the smearing technique invented and applied by interventionists between 1937 and Pearl Harbor, and so naively exposed and betrayed by Walter Johnson in his book The Battle Against Isolation. The absurd character of the whole process of smearing by the method of alleging isolationism has been devastatingly revealed by George A. Lundberg in his article on Semantics in International Relations in The American Perspective. Senator Taft put the matter in a nutshell when he asserted that to call any responsible person an isolationist today is nothing less than idiocy. One might add, malicious idiocy. The only man of any intellectual importance who has ever believed in isolationism was a German economist, Johann Heinrich von Thunen, 1783 to 1850, author of The Isolated State, 1826, and he espoused the idea only to provide the basis for formulating economic abstractions. In short, isolationism is no more than a semantic smear fiction invented by globaloni addicts. Governor Adlai E. Stevenson of Illinois is reported to have said in a commencement address in June 1952 that, quote, isolationism has not lost all of its emotional appeal, but it has lost its intellectual respectability, end quote. Unless one is willing to lapse completely into 1984 doublethink, it would seem that exactly the opposite is the truth. From Woodrow Wilson's war address on April 6, 1917, to President Truman's denunciation of cuts in the 1952 European aid allotment, interventionism has rested entirely on propaganda and emotional appeals. It has never been able to stand for a moment on the grounds of empiricism, logic, and fact. If results are any test of the validity of a position, no program in human history has had less confirmation and vindication than has the intervention of the United States in foreign quarrels. On the other hand, isolationism, which means no more than international sanity and the avoidance of national suicide, has never been able to appeal to war excitement, the propaganda of fear, and other emotional fictions. It has always been compelled to rely upon reason and sanity. It may be that emotionalism is a better guide for public policy than rationality, but to claim that interventionism and globalony can claim priority in respect to rationality is palpably preposterous. The internationalists of the earlier era, for whom I wrote and lectured from coast to coast for 20 years after 1918, were true believers in internationalism, goodwill, and peace, and worked to secure these objectives. The globaloni and interventionist crowd, while prating about internationalism and peace, have done more than anybody else, except the totalitarian dictators, to promote nationalism and to revive and direct the war spirit. They have created an unprecedented spirit of interventionism, militarism, and intolerance in the United States, and have helped to provoke a similar development in Soviet Russia. While blatant nationalism was checked temporarily in Germany and Italy, it has been stimulated elsewhere, from England to Indochina, Eastern Asia, and South Africa. The United Nations have steadily become more nationalistic and less united, and the world trembles and shivers on the brink of the Third World War before the peace treaties have all been negotiated to conclude the second. There is all too much truth in the statement of an eminent publicist that Alger Hiss's long-continued activities as an aggressive internationalist of the recent vintage did far more harm to the United States than handing over any number of secret State Department documents which he could have transcribed and transmitted to the Russians. The columnist, J. Franklin, has given us a good summary picture of the fruits of interventionism by contrasting the 20th century American casualty record under 5 isolationist Republican presidents and under 3 interventionist Democratic presidents. And here follows 2 tables with the Republican presidents and their years listed. And so this is Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909, William Taft from 1909 to 1913, Warren G. Harding from 21 to 23, Calvin Coolidge from 23 to 29, and Herbert Hoover from 29 to 33. For this total of 24 years in the United States in which the Republicans held the chief executive office, he has listed here 0 casualties, talking about people who were killed in warfare, presumably, international warfare in which the United States was involved. 24 years, 0 casualties. For the second table, we have Democratic presidents. That's Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921. For that period, we have 364,800 casualties. For Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1933 to 1945, 134,527 casualties. And then for Harry Truman, President, 1945 to 53, that's when this book was published, was 53, 129,153 casualties. So for 24 Republican years, you have a total of 0 casualties. For the total of 28 years for the Democrats, you have over 1.5 million. You have 1,628,480. And then for summary statistics, we have an average for the Republicans, of course, of 0 per year. And for the Democrats, we have an average number of U.S. war casualties of 58,160 per year. Now we'll return to the text. Though Catholic circles have been unusually fair in tolerating the truth about the causes of the Second World War, the pressure on the editors was so great that even the enlightened Commonweal permitted Mason Wade to attack Beard in its columns. But the most irresponsible attempt to attack Beard as an isolationist came with almost uniquely bad taste from the pen of Harry D. Gideonson, who reviewed Beard's President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941, in The New Leader. Beard was a native-born American who labored mightily for over 50 years to improve many phases of American intellectual and public life. No American historian, past or present, had a more honorable record as an active and effective intellectual patriot. He had never written a word which placed the interests of other nations above that of our own country. Gideonson, on the other hand, is Dutch-born. Surely, an honorable paternity. But there is little evidence that he has ever become completely immersed in Americanism, or has taken on a thoroughly American point of view. In his public statements over many years, he has always given evidence of a robust internationalism, which has little primary regard for American institutions or traditions. His internationalism appears to have a twofold basis: a hangover of the Dutch imperialism of the Dutch East India Company tycoons of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the virus of current American globalony. Anyhow, it has paid off remarkably well, for Gideonson was summoned from Chicago to Columbia University, and then, to the amazement even of his friends, suddenly catapulted into the presidency of Brooklyn College in 1939. While Gideonson finds other non-factual grounds for assaulting Beard, he holds that Beard's alleged isolationism is all that is needed to brush the book aside. Indeed, all that is required for that is the fact that, as Gideonson tells us twice in the course of his review, that it has been praised as a very great book by the isolationist Chicago Tribune. It might be cogently observed that the Tribune has also praised the Bible, Shakespeare's works, and Einstein's writing on relativity. But Gideonson has not laughed this off yet. If praised by the Chicago Tribune were not enough to destroy the validity of Beard's book, then, in Gideonson's view, it would be amply disposed of by the fact that he quotes, even sparingly, statements by eminent isolationists like Senators Burton K. Wheeler and Gerald P. Nye. Not even the fact that, which Gideonson concedes, that he also cites Eleanor Roosevelt frequently and with respect, could redeem Beard after he had revealed his acquaintance with the statements of the allegedly nefarious isolationist personalities. Though, as we've made clear, reviewers have naturally been a trifle hesitant in daring to minimize Beard's status as an historian, Walter Millis and Gideonson have not been dismayed or sidetracked even here. In his review of Beard's President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941, in the Herald Tribune Book Review, Millis contended that Beard is not entitled to rank as an objective historian according to formal academic fictions, but really belongs back with Tertullian, Orosius, Gregory of Tours, and other Dark Age exemplars of the devil theory of history. Let me take this opportunity to give my one deviation from the text for this recording. This concept of the devil theory of history. If I remember correctly, there's a short book published by Beard around 1936, and as Barnes told us earlier, Beard turned anti-Roosevelt in 1937. That's when he became staunchly anti-Roosevelt. And so pretty much the last thing he did before that was publish, as I recollect, the last thing that he did was publish this book about the devil theory of history. And what Beard says in that book is that you can't really attribute a whole bunch of historical significance to one person, especially for things that you don't like. There's a tendency, which obviously is true, for people to blame everything on Hitler or Stalin, or even if you're looking at our side of things, to blame everything on FDR or Churchill. And so what Beard did was write this short book saying that this is an incorrect way to go about things, and you really need to be looking at social forces rather than concentrating everything on personalities. And so he published that, and then the next year went off on his anti-Roosevelt crusade. And so it's just, it's curious how things turn out like that. I don't think he's wrong either in what he argued in the book or what he said later. But without that explanation, this statement that Barnes uses here about the devil theory of history might be kind of strange. And since I could remember what that was about, I thought I would add it in. So now we'll go back to the text. But it remained for Gideonsa to sail in and seek to divest Beard of all claims to any standing as an historical scholar. Just why Gideonsa should presume to pass on questions of historiography and to grade historians is not quite evident, though he has been doing so for some years. Professionally, though admittedly a very talented classroom orator and an effective rabble-rouser of the student body, he was only a somewhat obscure economist when he strode into Flatbush with his mace. But Gideonsa did not hesitate to administer a sharp slap to the members of the American Historical Association, who elected Beard to their presidency in 1933, by pooh-poohing the general scholarly opinion that Beard was the, quote, dean of living American historians, end quote. This notion and pretension, says Gideonsa, is purely fictitious. Actually, according to Gideonsa, Beard has only been a lifelong pamphleteer, and his books on Roosevelt's foreign policy are cheap journalism. In the light of all this, one could read with considerable amusement and sardonic humor an announcement in the New York Times of September the 8th, 1948, that Gideonsa opened the college year at Flatbush with an address to entering freshmen in what he gravely and sternly asserted that truthfulness is a main and indispensable quality of a college teacher, one which does not, perhaps, extend to college presidents. There were many other attacks on Beard's last two great books. They usually took one of two forms. First, there were efforts to dispose of them by brief, casual, Jovian, or flippant smears, without giving any attention whatever to the facts or meeting the arguments of the books. Such was Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s smear in the Partisan Review, implying that Beard sought to justify collaboration with the Nazis. Max Lerner's slur to the effect that they were, quote, two rather weird affairs, end quote. Perry Miller's description of them as, quote, two frenetic indictments of Franklin Roosevelt, end quote, implying, if Miller knew the meaning of the words he was using, that Beard must have been insane. And Quincy Wright's even briefer disposition of them as a strange argument. Strange, presumably, to Wright, in that the argument was based on facts. The other type of approach has been to smother the book under a vast welter of side issues, non sequiturs, and irrelevant scoldings. This was well illustrated by the procedure of Charles C. Griffin, an expert on Latin American history, who was selected to review Beard's last book for the American Historical Review. He buried the book under 4.5 pages of impenetrable, irrelevant, and disapproving fog, rarely coming to grips with the essential facts and arguments. About the only fair and scholarly review that the book received was by the chief authority in the field, Charles C. Tansel, in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. On the occasion of Beard's death, one might have supposed that the opportunity would have been taken to pay tribute to his greatness as a teacher, historian, political scientist, and liberal, at least in those journals to which Beard had been for years one of the most honored contributors, and that there would have been articles by writers who had been long admirers of Beard until he began to examine Roosevelt's foreign policy. Instead of this, we were treated to an obscene performance, which reminded fair observers of jackals and hyenas howling about the body of a dead lion. Especially in point were the articles by Max Lerner in the New Republic, October the 25th and November the 1st of 1948, by Perry Miller in The Nation, September the 25th, 1948, and by Peter Levin in Tomorrow, March 1949. In these articles, most of the smears which had been irresponsibly thrown at Beard during the previous several years were amalgamated, and he was portrayed as a senile, embittered, and confused isolationist, and a traitor to the liberal cause. There was even an effort to undermine confidence in Beard's monumental books which had preceded his volumes on the foreign policy of Franklin Roosevelt. Lerner held up to ridicule Beard's social and civic ideal. Quote, "A continental economy, spaciously conceived, controlled in a common-sense way, yielding a gracious life without all the horrors of foreign entanglements." End quote. As of 1953, such an ideal might well evoke the heartiest enthusiasm on the part of any thoughtful American. Lerner characterized Roosevelt's foreign policy as a consistent attempt to promote, quote, "the collective democratic will, reluctantly having to shape a world in which it could survive." End quote. How well it succeeded in achieving this result will be apparent from an examination of Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade, Chapter 8 of this volume. The campaign of vilification and distortion against Beard has continued long after his death. One of the most absurd attacks appeared in 1952 in a book by John B. Harrison, a teacher of history at Michigan State College, entitled "This Age of Global Strife." Harrison writes, "This prominent historian undertook, in the last days of his eccentric old age, to prove by ponderous documentation that President Roosevelt set out from the beginning of the war in Europe to stealthily and deceitfully maneuver the United States into a war whose outcome was of no real concern to the American people. It is a deplorable collection of half-truths and distortions. Anyone who reads it should also read Samuel E. Morrison's brilliant analysis of it in the Atlantic Monthly, August 1948." End quote. A book containing material of this sort could be published by the old and reputable firm of Lippincott 7 years after VJ Day. The reception accorded Chamberlain's America's Second Crusade was in keeping with the Blackout procedure and in line with that given to the Morgenstern and Beard volumes. Chamberlain was a too important and well-known author to be given the silent treatment by all newspapers and periodicals, though the leading liberal periodicals tended to ignore the book. It was naturally glowingly praised in the Chicago Tribune and equally lavishly smeared by the New York Post. The New York Times treated the book about as badly as feasible under the circumstances. While it placed a long review of a slight book by the elder Schlesinger on page 3 of the Sunday Book Review, it relegated Chamberlain's striking volume to page 34. It chose as the reviewer of the book Samuel Flagg Bemis, well known as perhaps the bitterest critic of revisionist writing among the historians. But even Bemis was unable to make much headway against Chamberlain's facts and logic. He frankly admitted that he would, quote, not argue the case with Mr. Chamberlain, end quote. In reviewing the Morgenstern book, Bemis had written that the American situation in late 1941 constituted, quote, the most awful danger that had ever confronted our nation, end quote. He still stuck to this thesis, despite his admission that there is no factual basis for it. Quote, that captured Nazi archives do not reveal any actual plans to attack the New World, as Mr. Chamberlain repeatedly stresses, does not make any difference. The intention was there, end quote. Bemis pictured Germany and Japan as, quote, the two colossi whose power in victory would have closed on our freedom with the inexorable jaws of a global vice, end quote. Therefore, our Second Crusade was a success and a necessity, even though Bemis admits that Russia is now more powerful than Japan and Germany combined could have ever become, and its power is concentrated in one nation, rather than being divided among two who might have often clashed. Quote, Stalin has stepped into everything that Hitler and Japan first started out to get, and more. Soviet Russia has rolled up an agglomeration of power greater than ever menaced the United States, even in 1941, end quote. Bemis concluded his review with what is possibly the most incredible example of foot swallowing in the whole history of book reviewing. Quote, one thing that ought to be evident to all of us, by our victory over Germany and Japan, no matter what our folly in losing the peace, we have at least survived to confront the second, even greater menace of another totalitarian power. We might not stand vis-a-vis the Soviets today if President Roosevelt had not entertained a conviction that action against the Axis was necessary. End quote. In other words, all the physical, financial, and moral losses of the United States in the Second World War were justified and well expended in order that we might face another world war against a far stronger enemy. With these comments, we may well leave Bemis to the logicians. The New York Herald Tribune Book Review handled the Chamberlain volume much as did the Times. It placed the review on the 12th page, following the reviews of many relatively trivial volumes. It did not seek out a professional critic, but assigned one of its own hatchet men, August Heckscher, to write the review. While the book was smeared as a revival of, quote, pre-war isolationism, end quote, Heckscher was not able to succeed any better than Bemis in disposing of Chamberlain's material and arguments. He had to rest satisfied with espousing the perpetual war for perpetual peace program of our current internationalists. If the First and Second Crusades have failed to provide peace, security, and prosperity, we can keep on trying. Other and more bloody crusades may turn the trick, even though Arnold J. Toynbee has admitted that any further crusades may leave only the pygmies, or perhaps the apes or ants, to wrestle with the aftermath. Perhaps the most remarkable review of smearing the Chamberlain book was the review which was published in The New Leader, written by our old friend Harry D. Gideonson. The New Leader is a sprightly journal controlled mainly by socialists and ex-socialists who deserted Norman Thomas in his brave stand against our entry into the Second World War, and by totalitarian liberals. Both groups were fanatically in favor of our intervention in the Second World War, and are now in the vanguard of those who wish us to enter a third crusade in the interest of perpetual war for perpetual peace and the suppression of red sin throughout the world. Chamberlain writes for this periodical, though his presence seems somewhat incongruous in such an editorial group. But the fact that Chamberlain is a regular contributor to the new leader weighed less heavily with the editor than his offense in debunking our first and second crusades and his warning against our entering a third. Thus it was decided that Chamberlain's book must be smeared, and a man was chosen to do it who could be relied upon. There was no doubt about Gideon's dependability for the task, both from his well-known general attitude towards interventionism and from his earlier elaborate smearing of Beard in the new leader. Gideonson did not let the editor down, except that he was only able to bring to bear against Chamberlain the same threadbare smears that he had used against Beard. He led off with a blanket condemnation, quote, "This is a bitter and unconvincing book," end quote. The worthlessness of much of Chamberlain's book, according to Gideonson, required nothing more in the way of proof than to show that he agreed with Colonel McCormick in the Chicago Tribune. Quote, "At least half the contents of Mr. Chamberlain's book is another rehash of the Chicago Tribune history of World War II." End quote. Gideonson repeated the old alarmist dud to the effect that if we had not gone to war against Hitler, he would have made a vassal of Stalin in Soviet Russia and would have controlled the old world, quote, "from the English Channel to Vladivostok," end quote. In the December 18, 1950 issue of the New Leader, Chamberlain submitted a crushing answer to Gideonson and other smearing reviewers. The New York Post called Chamberlain a totalitarian conservative and painted him as a special favorite of the McCormick-Patterson axis. The overwhelming majority of the reviews of the book did not rise above the level of smearing, the lowest point of which was reached in the review by James F. Menifee in the Saturday Review of Literature. That the progress of disillusionment with respect to the results of the Second Crusade and the shock of the Korean War may have made a few editors a trifle more tolerant of reality in world affairs was, possibly, demonstrated by the fact that Chamberlain's book was warmly praised in the review in the Wall Street Journal and was accorded fair treatment in the interventionist Chicago Daily News. Frederick R. Sanborn's concise, elaborately documented, and closely reasoned volume, Designed for War, devoted chiefly to an account of President Roosevelt's secret war program after 1937, was treated much like the Morgenstern and Chamberlain books, though it was more extensively ignored in the press. When not ignored, it was smeared in most of the reviews. The New York Times thought that it had taken care of the matter by handing the book over to Samuel Flagg Bemis for reviewing. By this time, however, Bemis had read the latest edition of my Struggle Against the Historical Blackout, with its account of his foot-swallowing feat in his Times review of the Chamberlain volume. So Bemis, while rejecting Sanborn's version of American diplomacy from 1937 to Pearl Harbor, was relatively cautious and respectful. Months after the book appeared, the Herald Tribune finally and reluctantly reviewed it, after much prodding by Sanborn. It handed it over to another warhorse among the hatchetmen, Gordon A. Craig of Princeton. He indulged mainly in the shadow boxing for which Walter Millis had shown such talent. The review, while of the smearing variety, was evasive, as had been Craig's review of Morgenstern's book in the Times years before. He refused to confront the facts, and even went so far in historical humor as to accept Cordell Hull's statements at their face value. The Sanborn book was smeared in most of the Scripps Howard papers that reviewed it at all. Vita, the Rocky Mountain News, February the 18th, 1951. although this chain had been in the vanguard of pre-war isolationism. A characteristic newspaper slur was that of the Chattanooga Times, which proclaimed that the Sanborn book was, quote, as impartial as the Chicago Tribune or Westbrook Pegler, end quote. Felix Whitmer reviewed the book in the New Leader, March 26, 1951. The editors had, apparently, become bored themselves with the monotonous uniformity of the unvaried dead cats thrown at revisionist books by Harry Gideonson. The Whitmer review was a masterpiece of doublethink. He smeared the book as a sad spectacle and a, quote, biased and myopic account of diplomacy in the guise of objectivity, end quote. He accused Sanborn of amazing ignorance of modern Japanese policies. Yet, a little later on, he expressed himself as in almost complete agreement with Sanborn's account of the crucial Japanese-American negotiations in 1941. Quote, it is perfectly true, as Dr. Sanborn proves, that in 1941 the Japanese seriously wanted peace, and that Roosevelt and Hull used every possible device to forestall it, and to provoke an open attack by Japan, end quote. He even admits that Roosevelt and Hull anticipated this attack. He excuses all this on the ground that our entry into the war was obligatory for American security from Nazi invasion and for the salvation of humanity, and that the provocation of the Japanese was only, quote, penetrating foresight, end quote, because Hitler and Mussolini were just mean enough not to rise to Roosevelt's war bait in the Atlantic. Hence, we had to incite Japan to attack us in order to get into the war through the Pacific back door. Even the new leader felt impelled to publish a rejoinder by Sanborn. We have already pointed out that virtually all the important periodicals, Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, the Saturday Review of Literature, The Nation, The New Republic, Harper's, and the Atlantic Monthly, had wisely decided that they could protect the Roosevelt and interventionist legend better by ignoring the book entirely than by smearing it in reviews. The American Historical Review does not even mention the volume in a booknote. The reviewing of the book by Charles Cowan Tansel, Backdoor to War, ran true to the form established with reference to revisionist volumes. The Tansel tome is more outspoken and more heavily documented than any other revisionist treatise. So, while it more violently enraged interventionist reviewers, it intimidated and restrained them in some cases. At least, they were more restrained than they would have been if the book were not so formidable an exhibit of arduous and exhaustive scholarship. Dexter Perkins reviewed the book about as gingerly and cautiously in the New York Times Book Review, May the 11th, 1952, as earlier Bemis had handled the Sanborn volume. He was apparently also somewhat concerned about a possible comment on his review in future editions of my historical Blackout. Aside from reiterating his well-known theme, to the effect that President Roosevelt was reluctantly pushed into war by the force of an ardent and alarmed public opinion, Perkins mainly contented himself with berating the animus and bitterness shown by Mr. Tansel. This bitterness appeared to consist, actually, in producing documentary proof that the Roosevelt-Hull diplomacy constituted one of the major public crimes of human history. The review by Basil Rauch in the Herald Tribune Book Review of June 1, 1952, was as brash and reckless as was Rauch's own book, Roosevelt from Munich to Pearl Harbor. It was not unfairly referred to by one reader as a, quote, masterpiece of misrepresentation, end quote. As the Byzantine Emperor Basil II earned his title of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, so Rauch can surely be awarded the title of Basil the Creator. As I've shown in my brochure, Rauch on Roosevelt, Professor Rauch in his book created for Mr. Roosevelt a foreign policy which bore very slight resemblance to the one which the president actually followed. So in his review of the Tansel volume, he created a book which had little relationship to the one he was supposed to be reviewing. The book and the review must both be read to allow one to become fully aware of the extent to which this is true. Rauch accused Tansel of making statements and drawing conclusions which had no documentary support whatever, though in the book itself, hundreds of footnotes and references to acres of documents were presented to buttress Tansel's statements. Backdoor to War was tardily and loftily smeared in the Saturday Review of Literature of August 2, 1952, by Professor Lindsay Rogers of Columbia University. Professor Rogers is not a court historian, but he was the leading court political scientist and court jester in the original New Deal quote-unquote brain trust. He pays tribute to, quote, the enormous industry of 5 years which this ponderous tome required, end quote. But he tells the reader that it has been largely wasted because Professor Tansel has outdone the late Dr. Beard in espousing the, quote, devil theory of history, end quote, and has interlarded his book with distressing diatribes. The devil theory of history appears to reside in the fact that Professor Tansel adopts a critical attitude toward the Roosevelt foreign policy, and that he assigns considerable personal responsibility to President Roosevelt for the course of our foreign affairs after 1933. The quote-unquote diatribes are occasional penetrating comments on Roosevelt and his foreign policy, which, had they been directed against the critics of Mr. Roosevelt, would have been praised by Professor Rogers as distilled wisdom and brilliant bon mot. The Tansel book was belatedly reviewed at length in The Nation, October 4, 1952, by Professor Charles C. Griffin, who had reviewed the Beard volume in the American Historical Review. It is evident from the opening sentences of the review that Professor Griffin regards any comprehensive marshaling of the facts relative to Roosevelt foreign policy as a quote-unquote violent attack upon them. The gist of the review was much the same as that by Professor Rogers in the Saturday Review of Literature. Both reviewers are compelled to recognize the vast amount of research which went into the preparation of the Tansel book, but Professor Griffin, like Professor Rogers, hold that all of this is vitiated by Professor Tansel's cogent and penetrating characterizations, which are variously described as, quote, opprobrious and objectionable terminology, invective, innuendo, insinuation, and the like. Doubtless Professor Griffin, like Professor Rogers, would have regarded this material as brilliant and praiseworthy verbiage if it had been written in praise of the Roosevelt policy. But at least Professor Griffin's presentation of his views on the Tansel volume constitute a formal and ostensible review, not a brief and casual smear, and he does concede at the end of his review that the Tansel volume has value in that it corrects the fantastic mythology which prevailed during the Second World War. The review by Arthur Kemp in the Freeman, May the 19th, 1952, was friendly and commendatory. Professor Tansel's book was harshly reviewed in the American Historical Review, October 1952, by Dean Julius W. Pratt. That the latter had lined up with our Ministry of Truth could have been ascertained in advance of the review by comparing his early trenchant anti-imperialist writings in his books and in his articles in the American Mercury with his recent America's Colonial Experiment. The flavor of his review could be readily anticipated. However, Dean Pratt did concede that the book was the most, quote-unquote, weightily documented of the revisionist works on the Second World War, and that, quote, Professor Tansel has produced a book of great learning, end quote. One statement in the review calls for a corrective comment, quote, the fact that a scholar with Professor Tansel's well-known views on American foreign policy was allowed the free run of confidential State Department files should lay at rest the theory that there exists a favored group of court historians who speak only kind words of Rooseveltian diplomacy, end quote. While Professor Tansel did examine more documents than any other revisionist historian, he had nothing like the free access to archives and diaries which was accorded to men like Professors Langer and Gleason and Dr. Herbert Feiss. Dr. Beard's attacks on the State Department favoritism eased his entry, and some of his former graduate students were in charge of important sections of the documents. Even so, he was barred from many, his notes subjected to scrutiny, and some of them were confiscated. One of the most extreme smears of the book was written by a professional historian, Professor Richard W. Van Alstyne of the University of Southern California, and published in the Pacific Historical Review of November 1952. Van Alstyne concluded that Backdoor to War is, quote, a striking monument to pedantic scholarship, but it is built on a tiny mound of historical understanding, end quote. He did, however, make one sound point, that the book has a misleading title, in that it is more a study of the origins of the Second World War than specifically of Roosevelt foreign policy. The New Republic did not review the book, but the editor, Michael Straight, subjected it to the lowest and most amazing smear that any revisionist book has yet received. In the issue of June the 16th, 1952, Straight delivered himself of the following material, suitable for presentation by the late Mr. Ripley, quote, this book is part of the devious attack on American diplomacy directed by Dr. Edmund Walsh, S.J., from Georgetown University. Tansel argues that the United States, not Germany or Japan, was the aggressor in the Second World War. These are the superstitions that occupied Beard in his senility and focused John T. Flynn's mania for hatred. It would be easily dismissed were it not such useful material for demagogues in the 1952 campaign, end quote. Nothing better illustrates the shift in attitude on the part of the New Republic since the 1920s, when it took the lead in promoting revisionism under Herbert Croly and Robert Little, even though Mr. Straight's mother was also financing the journal at that time. Very interesting and relevant, as bearing on Mr. Straight's charge that Professor Tansel's book was the product of a Catholic plot to smear Rooseveltian foreign policy, is the fact that the Catholic periodical, America, reflecting the interventionist wing of American Catholic opinion, published a rather bitter attack by Father William A. Lucy upon the Tansel volume in its issue of June 14, 1952. A very amusing and instructive example of the length to which interventionists will go in quest of smears of revisionist books is provided in the case of the Christian Register. This periodical is edited by Melvin Arnold, a liberal Unitarian and the head of the Beacon Press, which has published the books by Paul Blanchard that have so vigorously attacked Catholic political power. Yet, being an ardent interventionist and adulator of Roosevelt foreign policy, Mr. Arnold reached out eagerly for this hostile review of the Tansel book by Father Lucy in one of the leading political organs of Jesuit Catholic journalism, and reprinted it in the December 1952 issue of his own magazine. Professor Tansel's book was reviewed in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, 1952, by Professor Reuel Bartlett, Professor Bartlett had been put on the program of the American Historical Association at Chicago in December 1950 to criticize the paper presented at that time by Professor Tansel on the background of the American entry into the Second World War. He was somewhat roughly handled by Professor Tansel in the discussion that followed. All this was well known to the editor of the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. Nevertheless, he chose Professor Bartlett to review Professor Tansel's book, and the result was just what could have been expected. The flavor of the review is shown in the closing lines. Quote, "This book is unredeemed by humor, art, or insight. To read it and to write about it are unrewarding tasks." End quote. Thus far, the Journal of Modern History has not reviewed the book. In the criticisms of the Tansel volume by such professional historians as Professors Harrington, Pratt, and Van Alstyne, there is one slightly humorous item, namely the charge that Tansel does not support all of his contentions by citations from confidential archival material. As a matter of fact, the only honest and fair criticism of Tansel's procedure is that, like so many professional diplomatic historians, he relies too much on archival and allied materials, when other sources of information are often far more illuminating and reliable. Nevertheless, his professional critics contend that he never proves an assertion unless he brings archival material to his support, even though he may cite scores of more important types and sources of evidence. One might be led to suppose that Tansel could not prove the guilt of President Roosevelt relative to Pearl Harbor unless he could produce from the archives a confession signed in the handwriting of the late president. From what has been set forth above, it is evident that not one professional historical journal has provided readers with a fair and objective appraisal of Professor Tansel's monumental volume, Backdoor to War. The majority of the newspaper reviews smeared the book, though it was warmly praised not only by the Chicago Tribune, but by some other papers like the Indianapolis Star. In the newspaper reviews, the dominant note was Tansel's alleged bias and bitterness. In other words, his devotion to candor and integrity. Interestingly enough, the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer was apparently so displeased by the unfair reviews that he wrote an editorial, June 8, 1952, praising the Tansel volume and commending revisionism in general. Perhaps the most extreme job of smearing ever turned in on a liberal who attacked the foreign policy of Roosevelt was done on John T. Flynn, whose revisionist writings were limited to 2 brochures on Pearl Harbor and to a few passages in his book, The Roosevelt Myth. Flynn had long been a special favorite of the liberal journals. He was probably the leading specialist for the New Republic in exposing the evils of finance capitalism. His security speculation was a masterpiece in this field. His Graft in Business was perhaps the ablest indictment of the business ideals and methods of the Harding-Coolidge era. He was one of the staff who aided Pecora in his investigation of the sins of Wall Street. He was also an assistant to Senator Gerald P. Nye in the famous munitions and armament investigation. He was at one time a member of the Board of Higher Education in New York City and a lecturer at the New School for Social Research. Few men rated higher in the esteem of Eastern liberals. But when Flynn became a leading member of the America First movement and began to oppose President Roosevelt's war policy, his erstwhile liberal admirers, who'd taken to warmongering, turned on him savagely. Their animus increased when Flynn revealed the fascist trends in our war policy in his book, As We Go Marching, and when he told the truth about Pearl Harbor in 2 trenchant brochures. Let me make the parenthetical comment outside of the text that John T. Flynn was a very intelligent and perceptive man, and his specialty in journalism was in economics, as Barnes has noted. And unlike most people who've used the adjective fascist, and like only a few people in America at that time, maybe Lawrence Dennis would be another one, John T. Flynn really knew, he knew what Mussolini and the fascists were up to in Italy in economic terms in the interwar period. And so he really did identify the fact that Roosevelt and the Roosevelt cronies in Washington were sort of doing a half-assed version of what Hitler and Mussolini were doing economically. They were trying to implement some similar things over here, but without the political ideals and without the theory behind it. So they were simply borrowing mechanical aspects of it, and so it really didn't have the same kind of good effects that it did over there in Europe. But we'll return to the text now because I promise not to make too many of these comments so that we could just let the text stand for itself. So we'll get back to it. Since that time, he has been the victim of incessant smearing by the totalitarian liberals and the interventionist crowd. They've done their best to drive him into penury and obscurity. Only his fighting Irish spirit has enabled him to survive. Even the Progressive, despite its anti-war policy, joined in the smearing. A good sample of the irresponsibility in smearing Flynn is the statement of Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. in the New York Post to the effect that the Yalta Conference will redound to the honor of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Quote, unless a fascist revolution installs William Henry Chamberlain and John T. Flynn as official national historians, end quote. It so happens that Flynn has, for more than a decade now, been recognized as one of our most stalwart libertarians and individualists, and has even been smeared for being such by persons in Schlesinger's intellectual circle. One of the reasons for their frenzied hatred of him is his revelation of fascist trends in Roosevelt foreign policy and its political results. Chamberlain is also conspicuous for his libertarian trends and his protests against military state capitalism. The Blackout contingent was even more successful in their attacks on Upton Close. As a result of his candid radio broadcasts on our foreign policy, he was driven off the air, from the lecture platform, and out of the press, and his books on the Far East were virtually barred from circulation. Though I have personally written nothing on revisionism relative to the Second World War, beyond several brief brochures seeking to expose some of the more characteristic methods of the Blackout contingent, the smear bun has gone to work on me far more vigorously than was the case following all my revisionist articles and books combined after the First World War. The silent treatment has been comprehensively applied to anything I've published recently, in whatever field. When my History of Western Civilization appeared in 1935, it was very glowingly reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, of the Herald Tribune Books, and of the Saturday Review of Literature. The American Historical Review gave it a long and favorable review by the foremost American authority in the field. When my Society in Transition was published in 1939, the Times accorded it the unique honor of reviewing a college textbook on the first page of its book review. But when my Survey of Western Civilization and Introduction to the History of Sociology were published in 1947, and my Historical Sociology in 1948, none of the above-mentioned publications, so far as could be discovered, gave any of them so much as a book note. Apparently, the movement has gone so far that authors are being suppressed or given the silent treatment for fear that they might, later on, publish some little truth on world affairs. The author of this chapter was naturally suspect because of his writings on the First World War. The sub rosa activities of the Blackout Smearbund have gone much further. I have been smeared both as an extreme radical and an extreme reactionary, and as everything undesirable between these two extremes. One historian smeared me as a, quote, naive isolationist, end quote, though in actuality I was working for sane internationalism at the time of his birth. Also carried on extensive subterranean intrigue, seeking to discourage the use of my textbooks in the fields of history of civilization and sociology, where the content of my tomes does not even touch remotely on the issues of revisionism. Going beyond my writings, the Blackout Gestapo forced the most powerful lecture manager in the United States to drop me from his list of lecturers. The Blackout boys have not rested content with smearing those who have sought to tell the truth about the causes of the Second World War. They have now advanced to the point where they are seeking to smear those who told the truth about the causes of the First World War. At the meeting of the American Historical Association in Boston in December 1949, two papers were read by Richard W. Leopold and Selig Adler that endeavored to undermine the established revisionist writings regarding the prelude to that conflict. Adler implied that revisionism, after 1918, was, in its origins, a sort of Bolshevik plot, and that revisionist writers were, consciously or unconsciously, dupes of the Bolsheviks and unrepentant Germans. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., in an article in the Partisan Review, has even gone so far as to attack those who've written in a revisionist tone on the causes of the Civil War. The next step will be to attack the revision of historical opinion relative to the causes of the American Revolution, and to find that, after all, Big Bill Thompson was right in his views of that conflict and in his threat to throw George V into the Chicago Ship Canal. In other words, revisionism, which only means bringing history back into accord with facts, now seems to be rejected by the Blackout boys as a mortal sin against Clio, the muse of their subject. This attack on revisionism, even with respect to the First World War, is now creeping into routine college textbooks. It provides the leitmotif of Harrison's above-mentioned book, This Age of Global Strife. Not only are books concerned primarily with an honest account of the diplomacy connected with the coming of the Second World War ignored and smeared, but similar treatment is accorded to books which even indirectly reflect on the official mythology in this area. For example, A. Frank Reel's splendid and courageous book on the case of General Yamashita was rather generally attacked, and outrageously so, by John H. E. Freed in the Political Science Quarterly of September 1950. W. T. Couch, who has done splendid work as head of the University of Chicago Press, was relieved of his post in part because of criticism of his publication of this book. The best book on Japan which has been published since Pearl Harbor, Mirror for Americans, Japan, by Helen Mears, was allowed to die quietly by its publishers after the Blackout contingent began to exert pressure against it. While the Smearbund has usually rested content with an effort to defame and impoverish those of whom it disapproves, it went even further in the case of Lawrence Dennis and sought to jail him on the charge of sedition. Dennis, a brilliant Harvard graduate, had served in important posts in the American diplomatic service for 8 years. He had been one of the first to enlist in the Plattsburgh training experiment before the First World War in 1915, and had served with distinction as an officer in the war. After retiring from the diplomatic service, he was employed by leading banking and brokerage firms as an expert on foreign bonds. Like John T. Flynn, he was then a favorite of left-wing American liberals, and had exposed the foreign bonds fraud in the new republic at about the same time that Flynn was doing a comparable piece of work on the investment trusts. He incurred the wrath of the liberals by bringing out a book in 1936 entitled The Coming American Fascism. Here he predicted that the New Deal would wind up in a system of fascism, whatever the name given to it, and described what the system would probably be like. The interventionists were enraged by his weekly foreign letter, which opposed our entry into the Second World War, and by his The Dynamics of War and Revolution, the best book written in the United States on the institutional forces pushing us into war, and on the probable results of such a war. The pro-war forces induced Harper and Brothers to withdraw the book almost immediately after publication. Though Dennis is actually an aggressive individualist, he was accused of being an ardent fascist and was railroaded into the mass sedition trial in Washington in 1944. That the trial ended in a farce was mainly due to the fact that Dennis personally outlined and conducted the defense. But, though surely one of the most talented writers and lecturers in the United States today, he has been driven into complete obscurity. Not even Regnery or Devin Adair dares to bring out a book under his name.